What's up, everybody? Welcome to the 40/40 Vision podcast, the ultimate sports history podcast where hindsight is 40/40. I'm your host, Khaled Abdallah, and I'm joined today by my fellow host, Osama Dahoud, and we're excited to bring you another episode featuring the biggest what-ifs from an NFL team that you all know and love and probably mostly hate. Let's jump right in. Today, we're covering the top 5 what-if moments in Dallas Cowboys history. So this is just a few days or about a week after their loss to the San Francisco 49ers in the wild card playoffs. But to refresh your memory on the concept, so these are the top 5 what if / turning points in Cowboys history where we discuss what could have happened had things gone a little bit differently. So these are true 50-50 coin flip type moments where we can make some educated guesses on what could have been for the Cowboys if a few things didn't go quite as planned. So with that said, we can dive into number 1 and go ahead, Osama.
Yeah, this was interesting because neither of us are Cowboys fans, so we wanted to try and address the most important issues or what if moments for the Cowboys. So I've always been fascinated by everything around Jimmy Johnson's arrival and Herschel Walker. It's just such a fleecing. The Herschel Walker trade, probably the largest player trade in the history of football. It was in the 1989 season. I want to get into a little bit of the backstory and what happened before the actual trade itself. So when Jimmy Johnson in 1987 won the national championship game with the University of Miami, they went undefeated and he was highly coveted. So knowing Jerry Jones, he wanted to get the big fish. So he got Jimmy Johnson. And when he came to the team, I mean, he inherited a mess. You know, the days of Tom Landry and Roger Staubach and all that was kind of long gone. So he knew he had to work some magic. And he kind of looked at his roster and said, okay, I need value. I need to find a way to build through the draft, which is what he firmly believed would be the best way to move forward. So he actually first reached out to Al Davis to trade Michael Irvin to the Raiders at the time. But Al Davis actually said to Jerry Jones and Jimmy Johnson, don't trade him. He said, are you sure you want to do that? That's my Al Davis. He said, I'd be happy to trade for him, but you need to keep Michael Irvin. He could smell the end zone. So they decided Jimmy decided Herschel Walker was the only player of value on the team. He was convinced that if you could trade Herschel Walker and get a good deal, that they could build it through the draft. Any thoughts so far? You're a Raiders fan. You knew about that Michael Irvin bit, right?
So I actually didn't until I was doing the research for this pod. And it's funny. He's looks like a Raider. He plays like a Raider. He would have been a great fit. But Al Davis and Jerry Jones were boys for a long time. So I guess he wanted to do his friend a favor and not take the playmaker off his hands. So that was an interesting nugget.
Yeah, that's a good point. Off the field, he was nuts.
Yeah.
There were 4 teams interested in trading for Herschel Walker: the Vikings, the Browns, the Giants, and the Falcons. So being in the NFC, there's no way Jimmy was going to trade Herschel Walker to the Giants. They were already a good football team at that time under Bill Parcells. The Falcons didn't get him because they didn't believe they could re-sign him. So the bidding war was between the Browns and the Vikings. So the Browns actually made a pretty formal offer to the Cowboys that probably would have been fair comp, to be honest. There was 1 player, 2 future first-round picks, and 3 second-round picks. It's a competitive pick offer from the Browns. They thought Herschel Walker would take him to the next level, as the Vikings did, and Jimmy thought it was a fair offer, but he wanted more. So he used Cleveland's pitch as leverage to extract more from another team, and funny enough, it worked. He called Vikings GM Mike Lynn to tell him what Cleveland offered. He gave him a deadline, and Lynn one-upped it. He caved and blew Jimmy away by meeting this requirement of picks and players that would turn into a couple of Hall of Famers. But if the Vikings hadn't bettered the Browns offer, he was going to go to Cleveland, Herschel Walker. So in turn, the Cowboys would have gotten a lot less compensation, and the dynasty may not have been as would have not have been born the same way. Or tell us about the picks. I thought that was super interesting. The sales magic that Jimmy Johnson worked here.
Yeah, he fleeced them so hard. I mean, it was so like you said, this is the largest player trade in the history of the NFL. It winded up being a total of 18 players and draft picks. So this is how the compensation worked out. So Dallas ends up getting 4 players, 3 first-round picks, 3 second-round picks, 1 third-round pick, 1 sixth-round pick. So Dallas gets 4 players and 8 picks. And Minnesota, of course, gets Herschel Walker, 2 third-round picks, a 10th round pick. And for some reason, San Diego got involved in the deal, and Minnesota got San Diego's 5th round pick, and San Diego got a running back by the name of Darren Nelson, who's nobody's heard of. So it was just, I mean, just looking at it, I mean, Minnesota originally thought that they got the better end of the deal because they got Herschel Walker. But what they didn't know is that Jimmy Johnson, so a lot of the picks that, and the players, I should say, that Jimmy got from them, they were all conditional. So if Dallas cuts this player that Minnesota sent across, it would become a pick. And Jimmy, being the wily, sneaky dude that he is, he took these players and had no intention of keeping them. So he either benched them or cut them so he could meet the conditions of getting the pick. So his goal was just to stockpile as many draft picks as possible. And that's exactly what he did.
Yeah, so you got that completely right. He didn't want these players from Minnesota on the team. He wanted those conditional picks. So if he released or traded any of the players before 1990, he'd get draft comp. So he did that. Nelson was actually traded to the Chargers because he refused to report to camp. So he got 2 late round picks for him. He cut Stewart to receive the 2nd round pick attached to him, and the rest were benched per Jimmy Johnson. So I have an interesting what if scenario. Before I get into the details of why I think what Jimmy saw here with Herschel Walker, what else did you want to touch on?
Yeah, I mean, what I didn't understand is why Herschel Walker was so valued. I mean, I guess the year before he had a great year. He had 1,500 yards, 5 touchdowns. But the 2 years before that, I mean, he didn't play a full season. He had less than 1,000 yards. So maybe Minnesota was just banking on his natural progression after that. But I didn't quite understand why he was so. Maybe it was his legend in college and how great he was at Georgia. But yeah, I didn't understand how much compensation he was worth at this time.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. In the 3 seasons he was in Dallas, they were 17 and 35. So I mean, it's not Herschel Walker's fault, but it seems like Jimmy and the Cowboys knew he wasn't a player who could turn them into a Super Bowl team.
Yeah, absolutely.
So he had 4 100-yard games with the Vikings. Emmitt Smith, who they ended up getting later as a result of this, had 5 in his first 18 games. When he joined the Vikings, I mean, we know he wasn't great. He struggled when he was there. Before going there, they thought that he was on a path to becoming a huge star. But he didn't fit the Vikings scheme. He played 42 games. He only eclipsed 100 yards 4 times in 42 games. It was pretty shocking for a guy who seemed to be the next big thing, especially from the Vikings perspective. They gave away a huge haul. What did Alvin Gentry say when the Pelicans traded for Anthony Davis and gave away 1 million picks? Well, as a haul, folks, right? It was just in a huge, huge haul. In Emmitt Smith's first 18 games, he had more 100-yard rushing performances than Herschel Walker had in 3 years with the Vikings. He was very prolific. It was just a massive game changer.
Yeah, and I mean the Vikings were pretty good the few years before that, before they got Walker. And then, they just started to fall apart after they traded for him because, the cupboard was bare. They weren't able to restock their talent, and they sent all their picks to Dallas. And I think it's important to note some of the Hall of Famers that Dallas got with those picks. So I'll let you talk about that, but it's very impressive.
Yeah, they got Darren Woodson, Emmitt Smith, Russell Maryland. I mean, just a couple of players that ended up being a huge part of their success in the early to mid 90s. So a good point about the Vikings. They were solid the 3 years before they got Herschel Walker. They were 28-19, second in the NFC North every year. After trading for him, it was all downhill. They went 7-4 after the trade, and then they were just 6-10 and 8-8. The Cowboys, on the other hand, got way better after they traded Herschel Walker. Emmitt Smith was such a game changer. Troy Aikman, Michael Irvin, such a huge turnaround. They went 1-15 in 1989, 7-9 in 1990. Then they go 11-5, and they won 10 games each season from 91 to 96, winning through Super Bowls.
Basically all on the back of that trade. So I think it's a pretty clear what if they don't trade Herschel Walker for 100 picks, we don't get the Cowboys dynasty in the 90s.
And it's interesting because it's a lot of it had to do with Jerry Jones trusting Jimmy Johnson. So my what if is centered around that. So here's what Jerry Jones said, according to Jimmy Johnson, when he approached him about trading Herschel Walker. He said, when I told Jerry we were going to trade him, he said, really? You can't get rid of Herschel Walker. We won't score a point if we don't have him. And that's what Minnesota thought. This college guy, hey, we'll pull one over on him. We're going to give him these 5 guys. They'll fall in love with him, and we won't have to give up anything until the number 1 pick a couple years down the road. It was just so interesting how Jimmy was able to read the situation. So what I'm thinking is Jerry Jones tells Jimmy Johnson, look, I don't know who you think you are, but you're not coming in here and trading away our star running back. We can't score without him. Jimmy says, fine. But only 1 year, because Jimmy Johnson, by reputation, was such an aggressive, competitive person. There was no way that he was going to cave for more than 1 year in the event that he did. And you'll see that I'm right after this 1 year. They still have Troy Aikman, Michael Irvin. The team plays well, but Herschel Walker's production still fails him. So Jimmy Johnson gets to rub in Jerry Jones's face, and I told you so. Then they traded him away for the Browns deal, less valuable than the Vikings deal, but they're still able to build a good team. And Jerry then lets Jimmy trust the team at the bare minimum. And let's just, for the hypothetical here, entertain a different reality. Because I actually highly value Jimmy Johnson personally as well. And even though as a Niners fan, I'm willing to concede if Jimmy Johnson was there, that maybe they actually beat the 49ers instead of going down 21-0 in the 1994 NFC Championship game after the departure of Jimmy Johnson.
Yep. Going to touch on that in my next, in number 2 for me.
Yeah, I love this part of Cowboys history. So that's all I had on this. Did you have anything else?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because, I mean, what Jimmy Johnson built his reputation on, I mean, among other things, was being like this draft guru, right? I mean, people, I don't know if they still use it the same way, but he has that draft value chart that people still reference when they talk about trading, for example, the 5th pick in the draft for a couple picks down the line, if the numbers add up. So that's what he built his reputation on. And if he wasn't able to swing this trade with Minnesota, I mean, I still have faith that he would have been successful because he's a great coach and he's a great draft evaluator. But it definitely would have taken a lot longer. So they were able to flip this kind of depreciating asset in Herschel Walker into basically the foundation of not just a Super Bowl winning team, but a Super Bowl dynasty. And I think we talked about it in our Warriors draft, our Warriors pod, is that it's going to be a theme of one team, a good organization, fleecing a poor organization. to get incredible players or incredible picks. And this is just another example of that in sports history.
Yeah, 100%. It's never not shocking to see what the result of this of the Herschel Walker trade was.
Yeah, if you get an ESPN 30 for 30 on just the trade, I think it's called the Great Trade Robbery or something like that.
Yeah, the Great Trade Robbery. It's like one of those shorter ones, like 10 minutes, 15 minutes long.
Okay, so that was also my number one. So I think it's pretty clear that we both value that one pretty high. So I'll go ahead with my number two, which is, I believe, sort of tied to your number two. I think yours was more focused on the Jimmy Johnson era in general. Mine was just what if Jerry Jones and Jimmy Johnson had been able to get along after their initial beef and after the first two Super Bowls. So as you said, Jerry Jones buys the Cowboys in the late 80s. He wants to get that big fish coach, and he actually reaches out to Jimmy Johnson, who was a buddy of his from the Arkansas days. They actually both played on the 1964 national championship team together. So they went way back. So Jerry hires him. Of course, like you said, goes 1-15, trades Herschel Walker, gets a ton of picks back, ends up winning 2 Super Bowls. But Jimmy kind of flirts with the idea of taking over the Jaguars job. So the Jaguars were an expansion team at the time. Maybe he just wanted to live in Florida. And they basically bicker in public, and I'm sure behind the scenes as well. And Jerry Jones takes a shot at him and says, essentially, anybody could have coached this team to a Super Bowl because of how talented it was, completely discounting the fact that Jimmy Johnson is the one that got all this talent. So, yeah, basically, after they beef for a bit, Johnson, he leaves the Cowboys, takes a couple of years off, and then ends up going to the Dolphins. Yeah, he does pretty well in Miami, but doesn't win a Super Bowl. So to him, it's a disappointment. The Cowboys hire Barry Switzer. They lose to the Niners in the NFC Championship game in 1994 to miss out on the possible three-peat. And then after they fire Barry Switzer, there's a long list of coaches that are not to that same standard. So Chan Gailey, Dave Campo, even Bill Parcells at that time was not, was nothing special by then. So basically, if Jimmy Johnson stays, my what if is that they likely three-peat. They probably beat the Niners with Jimmy Johnson instead of Barry Switzer, and they get to build a new dynasty. They, of course, would have had to reload, but Jimmy, being the draft guru that he is, would have been able to restock and reload and probably extend Troy Aikman's career instead of letting him get beat up behind some on some bad teams. So that's my what if. I know you brought it up, but do they beat the Niners in 1994 with Jimmy Johnson?
They had the talent to do it. They were just lightning in a bottle for those first few years. They had such a great chemistry. Going down 21-0 that year, the Niners were really good. You'd need someone who demanded 100% the way Jimmy Johnson did. So I think that game goes a lot differently if he's there.
Yeah, and I mean, even that one, there was a moment in that game where Deion Sanders supposedly interferes with Michael Irvin on a deep pass. Yeah. That was brought up quite a bit by Cowboys fans for a long time, that if that was called correctly, maybe they end up winning that game. So it was close with Barry Switzer. So maybe, like you said, it just goes the other way with Jimmy Johnson. But I think the more interesting thing is, what happens the rest of the 90s if Jimmy Johnson is still around instead of Barry Switzer, Dave Campo, Chan Gailey, et cetera.
Yeah, it's interesting. I agree with you with a lot of what you said about Jimmy Johnson. And I think his talent was being able to assess value. Like, he was able to see inefficiencies, like he saw fool's gold in Herschel Walker, getting undrafted free agents, like Jay Novacek, who's a tight end, or having the coveting speed. This is kind of when you look at the size of players back then, everyone was just massive. There's just a kind of bulk and brawn. And he saw that where the game needed to go before anyone else had a chance to catch up. So yeah, they had a bad start when he was there, which was all part of the growing pains of building something special. So even with the departure of a lot of those talented players through free agency, he had a handle on the Cowboys that enabled them to always understand the mission. Barry Switzer, who ended up replacing him, never gave Dallas the sense of urgency Jimmy demanded. And Troy Aikman didn't get along with Barry Switzer. It just wasn't the same. And why I think this era of Cowboys history is so interesting is it's kind of peak Cowboys hype, right? Like the hype that exists today, the value of the organization is so high, and they were never more successful than they were in this like 1990 to 96, maybe 97. It's as good as it got. They've had flashes here and there, but this was the peak of the Cowboys we know now. And it's just so hard to win football games in the NFL, to sustain dominance over a period of time. It requires a certain level of genius. I know Jimmy Johnson wasn't great in Miami, but it's just really hard to prove that you're the best everywhere you go. Most coaches are associated with having most of their success in one place. It's not like Vince Lombardi was less of a coach because he wasn't good in Washington versus Green Bay, right? Or Bill Belichick's time in Cleveland. It's more indicative of where they find success versus how successful they are.
Yeah, and I think what Jimmy Johnson really excelled at was building a culture. I mean, you could make the argument that he gave his players too much freedom, with his days at the U in Miami, with the bad boys of college football and all that, with the Catholics versus convicts game, the type of players that he coveted. And then he kind of did the same thing in Dallas, right? These guys were running wild. They were making headlines, of course, off the field as much as they were making them on the field. But he won, and he was able to build that same culture in two places. He didn't quite do it in with the Dolphins, but being able to do it at college and the NFL level, it's indicative of a pretty great coach. And there's a reason he's in the Hall of Fame. And I mean, it's not like winning a third Super Bowl or a fourth Super Bowl would have changed his legacy all that much, because he's still a Hall of Fame coach. But maybe that catapults him into like that elite pantheon level of, the Belichicks, the Lombardis, et cetera. Instead of, I mean, he had to settle just for being a Hall of Famer. So.
Yeah. I think that there was a lot of drama in between, like Cowboys rings of honor and things like that kind of delayed his induction to the Hall of Fame. I think that the being able to assess maximum potential was his gift, and probably what he'll be most known for. Like, I guess he wasn't the dazzler of intellect like a Bill Walsh, or changed the game like a Paul Brown. His assistant coaching tree was okay. Norv Turner, Dave Wanstead, Butch Davis, Dave Shula. They weren't huge. They didn't distinguish themselves when given the opportunity, but it was Jimmy that was the gold. So I guess my what if is, if his relationship with Jerry Jones isn't strained, you see much higher quality personnel decisions consistently after what we saw from his departure. The valuation of the team, the hype following that Jimmy Johnson era is significantly more successful if he sticks around. It's not like he would have stayed in football too much longer. When he was in Miami, he cited burnout after 2 decades of coaching. It seems like he was kind of a miserable person. If you read about Jimmy Johnson, he now versus what he was like when he was a coach, is like two completely different people. It's like much more of a family man now, not the same. So I think, but at the minimum, Dallas has a deeper run of success before Bill Parcells gets there. Maybe he's in a front office role. He doesn't get chased out of Dallas. Maybe he comes back in a front office role, possibly. These are just potential alternatives versus he's just gone for good, and the Cowboys struggle to find to replicate that success.
Yeah, so maybe if he sticks around, we get a Belichick Patriots type run for a decade plus, versus kind of I don't want to say flash in the pan, but basically a magical 5-year run and then it's over. So yeah.
Right.
Okay. So yeah, I'll pass it back to you for your so I think, like you said, we were in agreement on 1 and 2. So I'll pass it back to you for number 3.
Yeah, so my number three is got a lot of attention on Shout out Cowboys Reddit, by the way. We appreciate you guys refreshing our memories and giving us your thoughts and ideas. A lot of good engagement when this question was posed to Cowboys Reddit. Mine is, what if Dez caught it?
Hashtag Des caught it.
Des caught it. Yeah, hashtag Des caught it. I mean, this was a goddamn catch. Let's get that out of the way now, very quickly.
Yeah. So in a recent SLS pod, we basically talked about how there's a difference between a catch, like a real catch, and an NFL catch, and this is a great example of that, how they overcomplicate it. So,
yeah. So, quick context: Cowboys and Packers both had a great season, 12-4. The Cowboys clinched the NFC East, which they had a really good year. So when they played the Cowboys, this was at Lambeau, I believe, right?
Yeah.
So late in the game, they're down 5. It's a 4th down play in Packers territory. Romo takes a shot at Dez. He's got Sam Shields on him. He catches it and basically tries to make he puts both of his feet on the 4-yard line. He extends for the end zone, and the ball is glued to his arm. But he falls down with the football on the ground, but it doesn't wiggle at all. He brings it back to him, and they call it a catch.
So he makes a football move, basically.
He makes a football move. That's right. Thoughts on this so far?
It was a catch, 100%. That's as simple as that. I mean, the fact that they ruled it a catch initially, and then after a lengthy challenge or review, they overturned the call. Kind of tells you everything, that it looked like a catch, full speed, and even on replay, it looked like a catch unless you maybe go frame by frame and just overanalyze it. But 100% catch.
And I feel like, I don't know if it's just me, that this play really started how we overanalyze catches in football. Calvin Johnson had one that was also questionable on how it was called after replay.
Yeah, that he caught the ball and then kind of took 2-3 steps in the end zone and then put it down to celebrate.
Yeah.
And it was called incomplete. I remember that play pretty vividly. I think they were playing the Bears.
Yeah.
But that was another atrocious call. The stakes weren't as high, obviously, but it was just as bad.
Yeah. This one is like, you'll hear me talk about this on other teams and on our podcast, is how these rules drive me insane about the catches. Like, we're staring at the ball during replays to see if it wiggled a little in their arms. It's a really miserable way to watch football. So that's what started it with this Dez Bryant catch. Like, we're overanalyzing it. What did they start calling it? The NFL and the referees started calling it completing the process of the catch, like falling down and never letting go of the damn ball, even though you caught it. Completing the process of the catch was born from this play.
Yeah, and I get the concept that if you fall and the ball comes out as soon as you hit the ground, whether you fall on your back or you fall on your chest and the ball pops out, if you don't take the 2 steps after that or before that. But every angle, every review, this was just a robbery, basically.
And I get if in the replay the ball wiggles in between his fingers just because we look at football this way. But if that happened, then maybe there's a case. But the ball doesn't move an inch. It doesn't wiggle. It's glued to him.
Yeah.
And that's why it's a catch during that attempt to get into the end zone. So, I mean, it's kind of hard to really say for certain what was going to happen after this. The Packers would have gotten the ball back. It's at Lambeau. The Cowboys were really, really good that year. And for the sake of appeasing Cowboys fans, I mean, if Dez catches it, they're ahead. And the Packers weren't great in the postseason after their Super Bowl run. They have a legitimate shot at winning the game. And they probably have 2 shots. Like, Rodgers marches down the field, they try to tie it, kick a field goal, score quickly, whatever the case may be. But the Cowboys had a good shot at winning that game and making a run. Everyone was healthy. Romo was healthy. His movement in the pocket was rarely better than it was that year. Him and Des Bryant was such a great connection. I think that they win that game just because of how the Packers postseason history is. To be honest with you, is disappointing as some of these Cowboys losses we've seen in recent memory. So why not?
Yeah.
Des catches it, they beat the Packers.
Yeah, I mean, if he catches it, if he's ruled down, I don't know if he got to the end zone.
Yeah, it's like it would have been at the inside the 5.
Yeah, it would have been really close. Let's say they score on the 2 plays after that. They go up by 2, or they go up by 1, and then possibly go for 2 to go up by 3. So the idea is that they could have lost this game, but the problem is that they got robbed of a chance to really win this game because of a bad call. Because after that, they turn the ball over on downs because it was 4th down, and they don't get the ball back. They're deflated, dejected, and the Packers don't give them the ball back. So that's the real issue, is not that, they would have 100% won the game, but just the fact that they didn't get a chance to win it because of a bad call.
Des caught it. Hashtag Des caught it.
And just to add to that, I mean, another thing is even if they beat Dallas, or if they beat Green Bay, they would have had to go to Seattle the following week and play an excellent Seattle team. They had the number 1 defense. But like you said, Dallas was a great team that year. And we got robbed of the chance to see them, play in a high stakes game, the NFC Championship game. So this isn't necessarily a Super Bowl deciding play, but it is a very pivotal moment in recent Cowboys history.
Yeah, and if that was the NFC Championship game, the Packers literally fumbled away, right? They had a huge lead. They fumbled it. They lost an OT. Give the Cowboys a shot. Let's run this back.
I think they were up 16. That's the famous, I think, Brandon Bostic onside kick muff.
Yeah, Bostic. Yeah.
Is it Bostic? Yeah. So that was
Orlis, Bostic, one of those guys.
Some 3rd, 4th string tight end that shouldn't have gone up for the ball, basically.
Yeah. I mean, Aaron Rodgers is our front runner. We've seen it too many times. Cowboys deserved a shot.
Okay, so that was your number 3.
Yep.
I had that one as my number 5. So I'll take the ball back here. So my number 3 is, what if Tony Romo held the kick during the 2006 NFC wildcard game? So this is the famous Romo, fumbled snap play. But to set the scene, this was Romo's first year as a full-time starter. He takes over for Drew Bledsoe. Cowboys are 9-7. They go to Seattle to play the NFC West champions. Dallas is up 20-15, but Seattle comes back and they score to make it 21-20. So it's a 1-score game. They fail on the 2-point conversion. Dallas and Tony Romo get the ball back. They lead a good drive. They get down to, inside the 10, or just around outside the 10 on the 11. So it's important that they were at the 11 and not the 10. So it wasn't 1st and goal. It was 1st and 10. So they go run to try to kill off the clock. They get the ball on 3rd and 7, and Romo hits Witten for what looks like a 1st down, but upon review is called just short, and it's about 4th and inches with 1:20 to go. So it's a pretty easy call. Seattle is out of timeouts. Dallas kicks the field goal, plays a little defense, and wins the game. So Bill Parcells sends out the kicking unit, and unfortunately, Tony Romo fumbles the snap, tries to run for either the 1st down or the touchdown, and gets tackled short of both lines. And then Seattle gets the ball back. They almost run out the clock, and basically, it's the end of the game. So this is a huge disappointment for the Cowboys, of course, because they were literally a kick away from winning the game. I think a 19-yard field goal away from winning the game. And what this does for Romo is it kind of establishes him, unfortunately for him, early on as a playoff choker. And he kind of gets that label. It comes back to haunt him a few other times. So my what if is, what if Tony Romo holds the ball, Dallas kicks that field goal, wins the game, how does that change the rest of Tony Romo's career? So any thoughts on that?
This is interesting. Yeah, this is the 2006 season, right?
Yeah, his first year as a starter.
Yeah. I forgot about this, to be honest with you. I know that when Bill Parcells came in, they started to develop Tony Romo. I think that he brought in like a couple of guys that played for him, like Vinny Testaverde, and I think Romo ended up coming out of the pack eventually. So yeah, keep going. This is interesting.
Yeah, and on that note, they almost traded Romo to the Saints when Sean Payton went there. I guess he saw his potential, but I believe Payton wouldn't offer us more than a third round pick, and Dallas wanted a second for Romo. So obviously they saw some potential there too, but they probably thought they were good with Drew Bledsoe. But basically, so if Dallas wins that game, they would have had to go on the road to play a really good Bears team, a 13-3 Bears team that had a top 5 offense and defense, but they did have Rex Grossman as their quarterback. So it's very possible that they beat the Bears, they go to the NFC title game against the Saints, they get an offensive shootout, and then who knows what would have happened. But I think the bigger what if is just Romo getting that label and having the weight of that disappointment on such a routine play. I think that really weighed down his career, and that was the monkey on his back, so to speak. So yeah, I think if they win that game, even if they get smacked the following week against Chicago, I think the rest of his career goes very differently. They probably don't have that disappointing loss the following year to the Giants, and a number of other, playoff disappointments.
Yeah, and I think that he shakes that, then things change tremendously. Gives them confidence. They have better runs in the postseason. And that one against the Bears, that was that Bears team that had that sloppy game in the rain, that Super Bowl game against the Colts, right?
Yeah, I mean they were manhandled basically by the Colts. They couldn't score to keep up with them, but it was a great Bears team. I mean, they had Hall of Famers at every level on that defense, or Hall of Fame level players. So it's not necessarily that the Cowboys would have won the Super Bowl that year, but I think it changes the next 5 years or so of his career. It just doesn't weigh him down like that.
I think it was Parcells' best shot too, I think, while he was there. I'd be remiss in not saying his nickname, the Big Tuna. I love it. It's a tremendous nickname for a coach. Did you know that?
He's one of the all-time personalities. And I mean, he leaves the Cowboys after that year, and they hire Wade Phillips as the head coach. So maybe if they win that game, Parcells sticks around for a couple more years. He was already at the end of his career by then, but just a really sad moment for a young quarterback that didn't deserve it. I mean, do you put any blame on Parcells for keeping him as the holder, even though he was the starting quarterback?
Yeah, you really don't see that very often. I think you can. Bill Parcells was a risk taker, and there was questions after this game if the game had passed him by. And this was probably the last Cowboys head coach that everyone probably thinks Jerry Jones didn't have as much say over, because after this, it's believed that a lot of the people that have coached the Cowboys have kind of just been there to take orders from Jerry. Yes, sir. Thank you. Yes. Okay. You're always right. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, he has a propensity for hiring yes men. But yeah, that was sad. I like Tony Romo. It's a good dude. So, I wish that went differently for him. So, okay, that was my number 3. So I'll pass it to you for your number 4.
Yeah, so my number 4 is about Taco Charlton. What if the Cowboys drafted TJ Watt instead of Taco Charlton? And it's super interesting because this was another one. Shout out to Cowboys Reddit. I was not aware how close they were getting to getting TJ Watt instead. So in the 2017 draft, Taco Charlton was the like you said, great name, 28th pick in the first round. He only ended up playing 27 games for the Cowboys. he played all 4 years in college. He recorded 10 sacks in his senior year at Michigan. He had 20 tackles. But TJ Watt was unworldly great in his 2 years at Wisconsin. So I had to look into why they drafted him, because, I mean, he played 4 years. Why didn't they take just, you'd think it was a no-brainer for Jerry to just take the Watt name alone versus drafting Taco. I don't think I could ever stop saying Taco. I'm getting hungry. So, I mean, obviously when he was drafted by them, it was met with mixed feelings. There was other cases that they were going to get TJ Watt, or maybe Takaris McKinley or Kevin King. I mean, their best case scenario was probably to take a top corner. I saw that on bloggingtheboys.com. The team initially had its site crosshair set on Adoree Jackson. Jerry Jones loved his playmaking ability, but the Titans ended up catching them off guard and taking Adoree Jackson instead. So they figured they can take one of their top edge rushers and hope that one of these edge rushers fell to them at 28. So the next three players on their board were Kevin King, TJ Watt, and Taco Charlton. So they obviously made the wrong choice on the clock. Here's my what if for this, and it's pretty simple. I mean, TJ Watt went 2 picks later. He has 72 sacks in 77 games played for the Steelers. Like, he just tied Michael Strahan's record for the single season sack record at 22. Obviously a huge misstep by the Cowboys. The what if is simple here. It's just a really egregious mistake in drafting. They would end up having, if they had drafted him, just a menacing, fearsome pass rush with Randy Gregory, DeMarcus Lawrence, and TJ Watt. That would have.
Yeah.
What's that?
Instead of Micah Parsons with those two guys, you get TJ Watt.
Yeah, it's a great alternative. It's not like like who knows? Maybe they still do business with the Eagles, and that trade that annoyed a lot of Cowboys fans. But this would have been a wonderful alternative. This pass rush would have been very menacing.
Yeah, and it's hard to understand why. I mean, maybe they go for a guy that's, has a longer or a bigger resume, because like you said, Charlton was there for 4 years. I mean, his production was pretty good in college. He had a 10 sack season his last year, but I mean, TJ Watt had 11 and a half sacks. So it wasn't like Watt was an underperforming in college or late bloomer or anything. Maybe he was a little bit of a late bloomer in college. So maybe that caused the decision to go with Taco instead. But yeah, that's an all-time miss there. And the funny thing is, now Taco is actually on the Steelers playing with TJ Watt.
Yeah.
So.
Irony. I get it. I mean, they had spent some premium draft picks on a couple other edge rushers. That DeMarcus Lawrence had 1 sack, but he played hurt most of the year. They used a 3rd round pick to move up in the 2nd round to get him. So I think it was a little unsettling that after 3 years that he wasn't what they had hoped for. So they get Randy Gregory in the 2nd round in 2015, and then he comes off a season a year later where he was suspended for 14 games. So, and then they learned he was facing a year-long suspension the following season. So they did need help. I just think they picked the wrong help.
Yeah. And I mean, like we said, it's an all-time miss, but these things happen in the draft, right? And it's just unfortunate that, I mean, it worked out for the Steelers, but yeah, all-time miss here.
Yeah. Taco. Shout out Taco.
Okay. So I did not have that one on my list. So that was your number 4. But my next one is another all-time draft miss, and this one is even more egregious. So this is my what if the Cowboys had drafted Randy Moss?
Ooh.
So it seems kind of like a no-brainer at this time, but basically Randy Moss was drafted, and he was in the 1998 NFL draft. He was probably the best receiver in college football. he was projected as a top 10 pick, but he had some, off the field issues, some character concerns, legal problems, whatever, that are covered in depth in a 30 for 30, I think it's called Rand University, where it talks about him growing up in poverty and all that. But essentially, the Cowboys, told him that they were going to draft him. They even had, a scout in Charleston, West Virginia, visiting, Randy at the time. And it even got to the point that Michael Irvin called Randy after the draft and apologized to him for the Cowboys passing on him. And, Michael Irvin told him that, my off the field issues probably caused them to overlook you and choose to draft Greg Ellis instead, who's a defensive end. So, Greg Ellis was a pretty good defensive player. He was in Dallas for 11 years, 77 sacks, 75 tackles for loss, 500 career tackles. So it's not like they drafted Taco Charlton. But what they missed out on is, perhaps the most talented wide receiver of all time. I wouldn't say greatest. You still give that to Jerry. But, one of the best receivers of all time, basically because they overthought it. And what this does is, if they had drafted him, Randy, would have played with Troy Aikman for a couple of years. Maybe that extends Troy's career. But, Troy was more than likely on his way out. But what this would have done for the Cowboys, it would have given them this incredible foundational piece. And even though, Randy was able to sort of pout his way out of Minnesota, pout his way out of Oakland, pout his way again out of New England, I don't think Jerry would have let that happen. Jerry would have laid out the red carpet. He would have made sure that, Randy would have felt taken care of. And what this also does is, by missing out on Randy Moss, Jerry Jones is kind of chasing that dragon for a long time, and he makes some really bad trades, trying to get that elite receiver in place of Randy. So he gives up 2 first-round picks for Joey Galloway from Seattle, who does nothing. They miss out on some good quarterbacks. And then he also makes another trade for Detroit wide receiver Roy Williams. He gets a first and a third for him, who once again doesn't do anything in Dallas. So, Jerry was trying very hard to make up for that mistake, and he paid a high price when he probably should have drafted this guy. So did you know about this? And what do you think about, what would have been for Randy if he was in Dallas?
Yeah, I did know that they were supposed to draft him, and like you said, overthought it, but I didn't know that. I think the interesting part is them trying to make up for it after knowing they bleeped up and getting a bunch of receivers that they overpaid for. I think that's it's not as egregious, but I think that it's a poor way to manage your team. If you feel like, oh, I messed up, I'm going to play fantasy football with draft picks.
Yeah, to use the poker expression, I mean, Jerry was on tilt at that point, because he found out very soon after that he messed up. In his rookie season, Randy comes to Dallas and he puts up 163 yards and 3 touchdowns. So, he played with a chip on his shoulder, probably more so against the Cowboys than anybody else, because, he felt like they lied to him. They told him that they were going to draft him, and they probably just got spooked. They got cold feet at the last minute. So, I mean, I don't know for sure if Randy, plays 10 years in Dallas or whatever, because he seems to be the type of dude that just wants to move around. He played with some really bad quarterbacks, or he would have played with some really bad quarterbacks in Dallas. It's like a long list of no-name guys. So maybe he leaves anyway. But at the same time, maybe Jerry is able to attract a top-tier QB free agent, because he could say, you get to play in Dallas. I'll roll out the red carpet for you like I always do. And you get to play with Randy Moss. So, yeah, a lot of things could have gone differently there.
I agree.
Okay, so that was my number 4. So I will pass it back to you for your last one, your number 5.
Yeah, and I'm glad that was your number 4, because it translates into my number 5. There actually is a correlation here I don't have to be a Cowboys fan to get into some fan fiction. If any listeners of this pod will know, I do love to get into a little fan fiction. So I'm glad that I've kind of stumbled into it here. So mine is, what if they drafted Tom Brady or Drew Brees? They had a legitimate shot at both of these guys, and coincidentally enough, could have paired them with Randy Moss.
Who knew?
Who knew? So in 2000, Troy Aikman was still the starter. He didn't have a great season. He was really past his prime at this point. 156 for 262, 1,600 yards, 7 touchdowns, 14 interceptions. He played 11 games that year. He got his 10th career concussion. I think it was a game against the Seattle Seahawks. And then 37-year-old Randall Cunningham took over after that. I think that it was poor planning. So Randall Cunningham plays, and then in 2001 they draft Quincy Carter in the second round. So in 2000 they don't have a first round pick. In 2001 they don't have a first round pick.
And why don't they have a pick in those drafts? Because
they traded them for Joey Galloway.
Exactly, because they didn't get Randy Moss.
They didn't get Randy Moss.
It's all connected. Yeah, butterfly effect here.
Yeah, incredible. It really is. So in 2001, they draft Quincy Carter. He gets hurt in the same season, and then they trotted out like Ryan Leaf and Anthony Wright and Clint Sterner. Just a huge mess. They ran with Carter for a few years. He even started all 16 games in the 2003 season, but he was really unimpressive. 17 touchdowns, 21 interceptions. So I think that this was just a poor succession plan for Troy Aikman. There were just a few lost years after the Aikman years, not having proper planning for this. So they could have drafted Drew Brees, like I said, but they'd given away these picks for Joey Galloway. So it's Tom Brady and Drew Brees and it's Tom Brady because in that draft, we looked at the board earlier and the only notable quarterback was Mark Bulger, but missing out on Drew Brees, also a huge whiff. So it ends up being a connection to Randy Moss. And it ends up being a bad 8 years of bad quarterback play in Dallas. Yeah. So it's just really unfortunate that, they don't plan properly for the post Aikman years, and chasing the ghost of the Randy Moss draft pick ends up really biting them in the ass.
Yeah, and it's just like you said, a great example of poor planning, right? It's like building, a loft in your house and the first floor is on fire. You know what I mean? It just doesn't make sense. And those years between the end of the Aikman era and the start of the Romo era were pretty bleak. They had that one wild card season with Quincy Carter where he had a pretty good year, but they weren't going anywhere. They weren't going to win anything. So it goes to show you that if one mistake can lead to another, and it can be compounded if you keep trying to make up for that mistake. So not drafting Randy Moss means you miss out on a very good quarterback in Drew Brees the following year, who could have been a great segue into the next era of Cowboys football. And instead they kind of luck into the Tony Romo situation. And that, ends up working out for them essentially, but there is a long time of mediocrity between those two eras. So.
And it just becomes that this 2 decades, almost 3 decades post Jimmy Johnson becomes elusive to Jerry at this point, the elusive championships after Jimmy. So yeah, I think that, like, the valuation of the team obviously is great as an owner. That's your number one goal, is to increase the value of your team above all else. But at this point, you can see it in Jerry. I watched the Cowboys Hard Knocks. You can see it on his face the last few years. It's like he really wants it more than the value of the team at this point. You can really see that he's trying to make sound football decisions, but I think at this time, these were not good decisions.
Yeah, it's reminiscent of the end of the Al Davis era.
Yeah,
where he's chasing a Super Bowl at all costs. He's bringing in all these old quarterbacks, trying to find the spark. So it's just, obviously Jerry Jones has had a second win, so to speak, in recent years, but those early 2000s were pretty bleak after Troy Aikman's career ended. So, okay.
That's all I got.
Oh yeah. So I had my number 5 was actually your number 3. So Des caught it. So I think we covered that quite a bit. So that's it for our list. I had 2 honorable mentions. You didn't have any honorable mentions, right?
Nope.
Okay. So I have 2 little fun ones. I won't go too deep into them, but my first honorable mention is, what if the Cowboys won the Ice Bowl, the famous Ice Bowl game, and the first Super Bowl? Could the Lombardi Trophy have been called something else? So in the late 60s, the Cowboys and the Packers were dueling it out for NFL supremacy. The Packers beat the Cowboys in 1966 and 1967, and they win the first 2 Super Bowls. And a few years later, they renamed the Super Bowl trophy the Vince Lombardi Trophy to honor, the legendary coach a year after he passes. But perhaps if the Cowboys win those 2 Super Bowls, maybe it's the Tom Landry Trophy. So that's a fun one.
Would they put a fedora on the trophy?
Yeah. Yeah, his famous suit and tie and fedora combo. Who knows? It would have been kind of weird because he still coached the Cowboys till the late 80s. So imagine the pressure of chasing a trophy named after you. And then another one is, what if Jerry Jones bought the San Diego Chargers? So apparently 20 or so odd years before he bought the Cowboys in the 80s, he tried to finagle his way into buying the San Diego Chargers in the 60s. And he actually agreed to the financing with the current Chargers owner. He's going to buy it for just under $6 million. And apparently he needed an additional $50K, or he needed a $50K deposit, and his dad wouldn't give it to him. So Imagine asking your pops for $50K to buy an NFL team.
Wow.
But so that didn't work out. But he would have been an owner 20 years before the 80s, and we never would have had the Jerry Jones Cowboys.
Huh. 50K was the difference. That's probably, if you factor in inflation, a ton of money.
Yeah. And he was in his early 20s. He just graduated from Arkansas, after playing football there with his buddy Jimmy Johnson. And his dad is probably like, "What? The NFL? The hell is that?" So yeah. All right. That's it for my honorable mentions. Why don't we go ahead and do the recap? So I'll let you go first, and then I'll see us out.
Yeah, sure. So my number 1 is the Herschel Walker trade. What if the Cowboys didn't trade Herschel Walker and fleece the hell out of the Vikings? Number 2 is about the Jimmy Johnson era and what could have been if things worked out between Jerry Jones and Jimmy Johnson. What if Des caught it? Hashtag Des caught it. This is my number 3. Number 4 was, what if they drafted TJ Watt instead of Taco Charlton? And number 5 is, what if they drafted Tom Brady or Drew Brees, or just a better quarterback in the aftermath of the Randy Moss draft pick?
Okay. And my 5, so my number 1 is also, what if the Cowboys never traded away Herschel Walker? What if Jerry Jones and Jimmy Johnson had managed to get along for another 10 years after the Super Bowls? Number 3 is, what if Tony Romo held that kick during the 2006 NFC wildcard game against the Seahawks? Number 4, what if they drafted Randy Moss in 1998 instead of Greg Ellis? And number 5, what if the refs got the Des catch call correct? Hashtag Des caught it. That's it for our show today, covering the biggest what ifs in Dallas Cowboys history. We appreciate you guys checking us out. Make sure to follow, like, and subscribe to the 4040 Vision podcast anywhere you can find podcasts, and make sure to follow us on all social platforms. You can find us on Instagram and Twitter at 4040 Vision Pod. Peace out, everybody.